So here is something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Right now, as you lie there, your body is doing something that would have seemed like outright sorcery to almost every human being who ever lived. Your immune system is identifying and destroying foreign invaders. Billions of white blood cells patrolling your bloodstream like a silent army that never sleeps. Your liver is filtering toxins. Your bones are manufacturing fresh red blood cells at a rate of about 2 million per second. Cuts you got days ago are healing themselves, new skin knitting together without you doing a single conscious thing to help. And if something goes really wrong, a burst appendix, a bacterial infection, a heart that starts beating irregularly, you can walk into a building and strangers in white coats will fix you. They will cut you open if they have to, replace parts, restart your heart, kill infections with chemicals that did not exist a century ago, and send you home in a few days. We take all of this completely for granted. But the story of how we got here, the story of medicine, is one of the longest, strangest, most heartbreaking, and most triumphant stories in all of human history. And that is what we are going to talk about tonight, the whole thing. From the very beginning, from a time when illness was believed to be the wrath of the gods, and the best a healer could do was chant the right prayer, all the way through to the world you are living in right now, where we can edit individual genes and grow replacement organs in laboratories. We are going to take it slow. There is no rush at all. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that is perfectly fine. The story will still be here. And honestly, there is something fitting about hearing this particular story as you are falling asleep, because for most of human history, the line between sleep and death was terrifyingly thin, and understanding what kept people on one side rather than the other, that is what medicine has always been trying to figure out. And here is something else to think about. The very fact that you can lie here in relative comfort, in a warm bed, in a room that is probably clean and dry, with a reasonable expectation that you will wake up tomorrow morning feeling more or less the same as you do right now, that is not the normal human condition. For most of the roughly 300,000 years that anatomically modern humans have existed, life was precarious in ways that are hard to fully appreciate from the vantage point of the 21st century. A cut could become infected and kill you. A broken bone could leave you permanently crippled. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous things a woman could do. A bad tooth could lead to a systemic infection. Childhood diseases that we now prevent with a few routine injections, measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, killed children by the thousands every year. The average human lifespan for most of history was somewhere around 30 to 35 years. Not because people did not live to old age, some did, but because so many died young, in infancy, in childhood, in the prime of life, from causes that are entirely preventable today. Every year of life expectancy we have gained, every childhood death we have prevented, every pain we have relieved, represents a victory in the longest war humanity has ever fought, the war against disease, suffering, and premature death. That is the story of medicine. Let us start where all these stories start, which is in the ancient world, thousands of years before anyone had the faintest idea what a germ was, or how blood actually circulated, or why wounds got infected. And the first thing you need to understand about ancient medicine is that it was not separate from religion, not even a little bit. When someone got sick in ancient Mesopotamia, around 3,000 or 4,000 years before the Common Era, they did not think about viruses or bacteria or nutritional deficiencies. They thought a god was angry with them, or a demon had entered their body, or they had broken some spiritual law and were being punished. The healer they turned to was essentially a priest. The treatment was prayer, ritual, incantation, maybe an offering to the right deity. And the thing is, sometimes it worked. Not because the prayers had magical power, but because the human body is remarkably good at healing itself when given time. And because the placebo effect is real and powerful. And because some of those ancient remedies, herbal mixtures, honey on wounds, certain plant extracts, actually did contain compounds with genuine medicinal properties, even though nobody understood why. And here is what is fascinating about that. If you dig into the traditional remedies used by cultures all over the world, ancient Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine in India, the herbal traditions of indigenous peoples across the Americas, Africa, and Australia, you find that many of them work. Not all, not reliably. But many traditional plant remedies have been validated by modern pharmacology. Willow bark, used for centuries to treat pain and fever, contains salicin, which your body converts to salicylic acid, essentially aspirin. The foxglove plant, used in European folk medicine for heart conditions, contains digitalis, still used today to treat heart failure. The cinchona tree bark, used by indigenous peoples in South America to treat fevers, contains quinine, the first effective treatment for malaria. These were not lucky guesses. They were the result of thousands of years of trial and error, generation after generation observing what helped and what did not, passing that knowledge down. It was not science in the modern sense. There was no controlled testing, no understanding of mechanisms, but it was empirical. People noticed what worked and remembered it. And that matters, because it means the practice of medicine is older than civilization itself. It is one of the most fundamental human activities. We have always tried to heal each other. Long before there were doctors or hospitals or pharmaceutical companies, there were people holding vigil at the bedsides of the sick, preparing herbal remedies, setting broken bones, easing the suffering of the dying. That impulse, the impulse to care for one another in our most vulnerable moments, is woven into the very fabric of what it means to be human. The Egyptians were particularly fascinating in this regard. They had a medical tradition going back at least to 2600 BCE, and they left behind some of the oldest medical documents in existence. The most famous is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 BCE, but probably copied from texts several centuries older. And here is what is remarkable about it. It is surprisingly rational. It describes 48 surgical cases, things like fractures and dislocations and wounds, and for each one, it gives a diagnosis, a prognosis, and a treatment recommendation. The cases are organized from head to toe, which tells you something about the systematic thinking of the authors. Some of the treatments are practical and sensible, immobilizing broken bones with splints, closing wounds with stitches made from linen thread, using honey as an antibacterial dressing, which actually works because honey is hygroscopic and creates an environment hostile to bacteria, though the Egyptians obviously did not know that. They also used willow leaves for inflammation, and there is evidence they applied moldy bread to infected wounds, which, when you think about it, is a crude form of antibiotic therapy 3,000 years before Fleming. But then, mixed right in with the practical advice, there are incantations and magical spells. The rational and the supernatural sitting side by side on the same papyrus, and nobody saw any contradiction. The Egyptians also practiced something that would turn out to be enormously important for the future of medicine, even though they did it for entirely religious reasons: mummification. When they preserved their dead, they removed and examined internal organs. They became intimately familiar with the liver, the lungs, the intestines, the brain, which, interestingly, they considered unimportant and discarded, pulling it out through the nose with hooks, while carefully preserving the heart, which they believed was the seat of intelligence and the soul. They were wrong about the brain, spectacularly wrong. But the point is that they were looking inside the human body, systematically, and recording what they found. That is anatomy, even if they did not call it that. Meanwhile, in ancient India, a tradition of medicine was developing that would produce its own remarkable achievements. Ayurvedic medicine, which dates back to at least 1500 BCE, developed an extraordinarily sophisticated pharmacopoeia, a catalog of hundreds of medicinal plants and minerals, along with detailed guidelines for diet, exercise, hygiene, and mental health. The ancient Indian surgeon Sushruta, who lived sometime around the 6th century BCE, wrote a comprehensive surgical text, the Sushruta Samhita, that described over 100 surgical instruments and over 300 surgical procedures, including rhinoplasty, the reconstruction of the nose, using a technique involving a skin flap from the forehead that is remarkably similar to methods used by plastic surgeons today. He also described the removal of cataracts using a curved needle, a procedure called couching, which involved pushing the clouded lens out of the line of vision. Indian surgical knowledge was so advanced that when European physicians encountered it centuries later, they were astonished. The nose reconstruction technique, in particular, was brought to Europe in the 18th century and became the foundation of modern plastic surgery. In China, traditional medicine developed along its own path, producing acupuncture, an elaborate herbal pharmacopoeia, and diagnostic techniques like pulse reading that remain in practice today. The Chinese were also the first to practice inoculation against smallpox, deliberately introducing dried smallpox scab material into the nostrils of healthy people to induce a mild form of the disease and confer immunity, a practice that dates back to at least the 10th century CE and predates European vaccination by 800 years. The practice was known as variolation, and it involved blowing dried smallpox scab powder into the nostrils of healthy individuals, inducing a mild infection that conferred lasting immunity. It was a remarkable insight, born of careful observation over centuries, and it demonstrates that the fundamental logic of immunization, using a controlled exposure to build protection against a future threat, was discovered independently by multiple cultures long before the mechanisms were understood. The point is this: the story of medicine is not a single story. It is many stories, happening simultaneously on different continents, in different cultures, with different assumptions and different methods, but all driven by the same fundamental human impulse, the desire to understand suffering and to alleviate it. But the real revolution in ancient medicine, the moment when someone first said, "Wait, maybe illness is not caused by gods and demons, maybe it has natural causes that we can understand and treat rationally," that moment happened in Greece, on a small island in the Aegean Sea, around the 5th century BCE. And the person most associated with it is someone whose name you almost certainly know, even if you have never studied medicine in your life: Hippocrates of Kos. Now, here is the thing about Hippocrates, and this is true of a lot of ancient figures: we actually know very little about him as a person. He was born around 460 BCE on the island of Kos. He practiced and taught medicine. He was famous in his own time. Plato mentions him, Aristotle mentions him, but the collection of medical writings attributed to him, the so-called Hippocratic Corpus, was almost certainly written by many different authors over a period of decades or even centuries. It is a library, not a book, and Hippocrates himself probably wrote only a fraction of it, if any. But the ideas in those texts, the approach to medicine they represent, that is what matters, and it really was revolutionary. Here is the core idea, and it sounds almost obvious now, but in the 5th century BCE, it was genuinely radical. The Hippocratic texts argued that disease has natural causes, not divine ones, not supernatural ones, natural ones, rooted in the body itself and in its environment. There is a famous Hippocratic text about epilepsy, which the Greeks called the sacred disease, because they believed it was caused by divine possession. The Hippocratic author flatly rejects this. He argues that epilepsy is no more sacred or divine than any other disease. It has a natural cause rooted in the brain, and people who attribute it to the gods are charlatans, using superstition to cover their own ignorance. That is an extraordinary statement for the 5th century BCE. That is a declaration of intellectual independence from the entire religious framework that had governed medicine for millennia. When someone got sick, the Hippocratic physician argued, you should not be looking for which god to appease. You should be looking at what they ate, what they drank, where they lived, what the climate was like, how they were sleeping. You should be observing the patient carefully, noting their symptoms, tracking how the illness progresses over time. And the Hippocratic tradition gave medicine something else that endures to this day, an ethical framework. You have heard of the Hippocratic Oath. The original version is ancient, and doctors do not really swear it in its classical form anymore, but the principles behind it, do no harm, act in the patient interest, maintain confidentiality, those principles are still the ethical bedrock of medicine. Think about that for a second. An ethical code written 2,500 years ago on a Greek island still shapes how your doctor behaves today. But the Hippocratic physicians also got some things very, very wrong. And the biggest thing they got wrong was their theory of how the body actually works. They believed in what is called humorism, the idea that the human body contains 4 fundamental fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a state of balance among these 4 humors. Disease was an imbalance. If you had too much blood, you would be feverish and overheated. Too much phlegm, you would be sluggish and cold. Too much yellow bile, irritable and aggressive. Too much black bile, melancholy and withdrawn. In fact, those personality descriptions gave us the words we still use today: sanguine from blood, phlegmatic from phlegm, choleric from bile, and melancholic from black bile. The language of the humors is still embedded in how we talk about temperament, even though the underlying theory is completely wrong. The treatment was to restore balance, often by removing the excess humor. And this is where things get uncomfortable, because the most common way to remove excess blood was, well, to remove it: bloodletting, cutting open a vein and draining blood from the patient. This practice, which almost certainly did far more harm than good, would persist in Western medicine for over 2,000 years. It was done with lancets, with leeches, with cupping glasses that created suction on the skin. It was prescribed for fevers, for infections, for headaches, for pneumonia, for virtually any ailment you can name. George Washington, the first president of the United States, was almost certainly killed faster by the bloodletting his doctors inflicted on him during his final illness in 1799 than by the illness itself. He had a throat infection, probably epiglottitis, and his doctors, following the best medical practice of their era, drained nearly 2.5 liters of blood from him in less than 12 hours. That is about 40% of his total blood volume. He died that evening. 3 prominent physicians, all acting with the best intentions, all following established protocol, effectively bled the first president to death. So here is the lesson, and it is an important one. Having a theoretical framework, even an elegant one, is not the same as being right. When your theory is wrong but coherent, it can sustain itself for centuries, because you can always explain away failures within the framework. Patient died after bloodletting. Obviously, we did not take enough blood, or we took it from the wrong vein. The theory is never at fault, only the application. You see this pattern over and over in the history of medicine, and it should make us humble about our own certainties today. And it is worth saying this explicitly, because it is tempting to look back at bloodletting and leeches and humoral theory and think, well, those people were just ignorant. We know so much more now. That could never happen to us. But consider this. In the 1950s, doctors routinely told pregnant women that smoking was harmless. Some even recommended it to calm their nerves. In the 1960s, physicians prescribed thalidomide, a sedative, to pregnant women for morning sickness, resulting in thousands of children born with severe limb deformities. In the 1980s, doctors routinely dismissed the pain of infants and newborns, performing surgery on babies with minimal or no anesthesia because the prevailing belief was that newborns did not feel pain the way adults did. They were wrong about that, catastrophically wrong, and it took years of evidence and advocacy to change the practice. In each of these cases, the medical profession acted with confidence, with the full weight of established knowledge behind them, and they were wrong. The lesson of humorism is not that ancient physicians were foolish. The lesson is that even the most confident, most well-intentioned medical consensus can be built on foundations that are completely, dangerously incorrect. And the only protection against that, the only thing that has ever worked, is the willingness to question, to test, to observe, and to admit when the evidence contradicts the theory. And that willingness requires something that is surprisingly rare, the courage to say, I do not know. Medicine at its best is honest about uncertainty. The best doctors are the ones who can hold in their minds, simultaneously, a deep confidence in their training and a genuine humility about the limits of their knowledge. They are the ones who say, this is what I think is going on, but I could be wrong, and here is what we are going to do to find out. That combination, confidence and humility, expertise and openness, is the hardest thing in medicine to maintain, and it is the most important, because the history of medicine is littered with disasters that were caused not by ignorance, but by certainty, by physicians who were so sure they were right that they stopped looking at the evidence, stopped listening to their patients, stopped questioning their assumptions. Bloodletting, heroic purging, thalidomide, lobotomy. Every one of these disasters was perpetrated by people who were absolutely certain they were helping. Now, the person who took Hippocratic medicine and turned it into a comprehensive, monolithic body of knowledge was a man born in the city of Pergamon, in what is now Turkey, around 129 CE. His name was Galen, and he is one of those towering figures who is simultaneously incredibly impressive and incredibly frustrating, because his brilliance was matched only by his absolute, unshakable certainty that he was right about everything. Galen was prolific. He wrote hundreds of texts on anatomy, physiology, diagnosis, treatment, and philosophy. He was physician to the Roman gladiators in Pergamon, which gave him unusual access to wounds and trauma, essentially a crash course in practical anatomy. He later became personal physician to several Roman emperors, including Marcus Aurelius. And he was an experimenter. He dissected animals, pigs, monkeys, goats, and drew conclusions about human anatomy from what he found. He demonstrated that the arteries carry blood, not air. He showed that the brain controls the body by severing the spinal cords of living animals at different levels and observing which functions were lost. He identified that the recurrent laryngeal nerve controls the voice by showing that cutting it in a squealing pig silenced the animal instantly. But Galen built everything on the Hippocratic foundation of the four humors, and he elaborated it into an incredibly detailed, incredibly confident system. His system was so comprehensive, so internally consistent, so authoritatively written, that it became gospel. For over 1,000 years after his death, questioning Galen was essentially medical heresy. His anatomical descriptions, based on animal dissections and therefore often wrong when applied to humans, were treated as infallible. And Galen authority actively prevented progress. When reality conflicted with Galen, people chose Galen. For over a millennium, how many people suffered, how many died, because the medical profession was more loyal to a dead man books than to what was actually in front of them? That question haunts the entire history of medicine, and it is worth asking not just as a historical curiosity, but as a warning. Because the pattern of an authority figure whose words become sacred text, whose errors become invisible because questioning them is unthinkable, that pattern shows up again and again. It is not unique to Galen. It is a feature of how human institutions work, and medicine has been as vulnerable to it as any other field. And here is something else worth considering. During the centuries when Galen reigned supreme in Europe, the practice of medicine for ordinary people bore very little resemblance to the elaborate theories in the textbooks. If you were a peasant in medieval England and you got sick, you did not visit a Galenic physician. You could not afford one, and there were very few of them anyway. Instead, you went to the local healer, the wise woman, the herbalist, the barber who also pulled teeth and set bones. These practitioners operated in a world of folk remedies, practical experience, and common sense that existed in parallel to, and largely independent of, the academic medical tradition. Some of what they did was useless. Some of it was actively harmful. But some of it worked, and worked well, precisely because it was based on generations of accumulated practical experience rather than on theoretical speculation. The gap between academic medicine and practical healing is a recurring theme in this story, and it is one of the reasons that progress was so painfully slow. The people who had the theories often did not treat patients, and the people who treated patients often could not read the theories. And this brings us to one of the most extraordinary periods in the history of medicine, a period that does not always get the attention it deserves. While Europe was sinking into the early medieval period, and much of the Greek and Roman medical knowledge was being lost or neglected, the Islamic world was preserving it, translating it, and, crucially, building on it. The Islamic Golden Age, roughly from the 8th through the 14th centuries, produced some of the most important physicians and medical thinkers in history, and their contributions are woven into the fabric of modern medicine, whether most people realize it or not. The intellectual infrastructure was remarkable. The Great Translation movement, centered in Baghdad House of Wisdom, systematically translated Greek, Persian, and Indian medical texts into Arabic. Scholars did not just translate, they annotated, critiqued, and extended the original works. They built hospitals, called Bemaristans, that were far ahead of anything in contemporary Europe, with separate wards for different conditions, running water, outpatient clinics, and even early forms of medical licensing. The standout figure here is a man known in the West as Avicenna, though his actual name was Ibn Sina, and he was born around 980 CE near Bukhara, in what is now Uzbekistan. Ibn Sina was a polymath, physician, philosopher, astronomer, poet, mathematician. By his own account, he had memorized the entire Quran by the age of 10. By 16, he was practicing medicine, and his great work, The Canon of Medicine, completed around 1025, is one of the most influential medical textbooks ever written. It systematized the entire medical knowledge of the ancient and Islamic worlds into a single, coherent framework. When it was translated into Latin in the 12th century, it became the standard medical textbook at European universities, for 500 years. But Ibn Sina did not just compile. He made original contributions. He recognized that tuberculosis was contagious. He described the symptoms of diabetes. He understood the concept of quarantine. He wrote extensively about the connection between emotional states and physical health. And he tested medicines systematically, laying down rules for clinical trials that sound remarkably modern. There were others too. Al-Razi, known as Rhazes, who worked in Baghdad and wrote the first clear clinical descriptions, distinguishing smallpox from measles. Al-Zahrawi, known as Al-Bukassis, working in Cordoba in Islamic Spain, who wrote a 30-volume encyclopedia of surgery, describing instruments and techniques used for centuries, including catgut for internal stitches. Ibn al-Nafis, working in Cairo in the 13th century, who correctly described pulmonary circulation 3 centuries before William Harvey, is usually credited with the discovery. And here is what is both ironic and beautiful about this period. The Islamic scholars preserved and transmitted Greek medical knowledge back to Europe at a time when Europe had largely forgotten it. Western medicine was reborn because Islamic scholars had kept the flame alive. And let me add one more thing about this period, because it illustrates a point that is easy to miss. The Islamic medical scholars did not just preserve and transmit knowledge. They fundamentally changed the practice of medicine by establishing the hospital as we know it. The Bimaristans of the Islamic world were institutions of a kind that did not exist in Europe. They had separate wards for different conditions, male and female sections, pharmacies, lecture halls for teaching medical students, and physicians who were required to pass examinations before they could practice. The hospital at Cairo, founded in 1284, could accommodate 8,000 patients and had sections for surgery, ophthalmology, and even a ward specifically for mental illness, where patients were treated with music therapy, pleasant surroundings, and storytelling, a far cry from the chains and dungeons that awaited the mentally ill in medieval Europe. When European travelers encountered these institutions during the Crusades, they were astonished. The concept of the hospital as a place of organized healing, with trained staff, systematic record-keeping, and a responsibility to treat anyone regardless of their ability to pay, is one of the Islamic world's great gifts to medicine, and it is a gift whose echoes are still felt every time you walk into a modern hospital. But even as that knowledge was flowing back into Europe, something was happening that would shape the next several centuries: the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1353, the bubonic plague swept across Europe, killing somewhere between 30 and 60% of the entire population. Entire cities were emptied. Entire villages simply disappeared, and medicine was utterly helpless. The physicians had no idea what caused the plague, no idea how it spread, no effective treatment. They fell back on humoral theories. Perhaps the air was poisoned, a miasma caused by earthquakes or planetary alignments. They recommended burning aromatic herbs, carrying flowers, avoiding bathing because open pores might let in the poisoned air. The famous plague doctor beaked mask was stuffed with flowers and spices because they thought pleasant smells would ward off the disease. It did not work, because the plague was caused by a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, transmitted by fleas on rats. The social consequences of the plague were as profound as the medical ones. With a third or more of the population dead, the labor shortage that followed transformed European society. Serfs who had been tied to the land suddenly had bargaining power. Wages rose. The feudal system began to crack. The church, which had been unable to protect its flock from the disease, lost some of its moral authority. People began to question institutions that had failed them so catastrophically, and that questioning, that willingness to challenge received wisdom, would eventually contribute to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution. In a strange and terrible way, the Black Death, by destroying the old order, helped create the conditions for the new one. It is one of the darkest ironies in all of history that so much human progress was built, in part, on the foundations of so much human suffering. And the plague did not just come once. It returned again and again over the following centuries. The Great Plague of London, in 1665, killed roughly a quarter of the city population. Plague outbreaks continued in various parts of the world well into the 20th century. The Third Great Pandemic, which began in China in 1855, killed millions in India and spread to ports around the world. It was during this third pandemic, in 1894, that the bacterium Yersinia pestis was finally identified by Alexandre Yersin, a student of Pasteur, working in Hong Kong. And it was not until 1898 that Paul-Louis Simond, another French physician, proved the role of rat fleas in transmitting the disease. 6 centuries of plague, and it took that long to figure out what was causing it. 6 centuries of wrong theories, of miasma and bad air and divine punishment, before the truth was finally seen through a microscope. The Black Death exposed the total inadequacy of medieval medicine, and in a strange way, that exposure planted the seeds of change. Because if the old theories could not explain or prevent this catastrophe, maybe the old theories were wrong. That someone who stepped forward was born in Brussels in 1514 and would tear down the edifice of Galenic anatomy brick by brick. His name was Andreas Vesalius. Challenging Galen was not just an academic disagreement. Galen writings were intertwined with church authority and centuries of tradition. Saying Galen was wrong about anatomy was almost as dangerous as saying the earth moved around the sun, and it is no coincidence that Vesalius published his masterwork in the same year, 1543, that Copernicus published his. At most European universities in the early 16th century, anatomy lessons were theater. A professor sat in an elevated chair reading aloud from Galen, while a barber surgeon actually cut open the cadaver. The professor never touched the body. If what they saw did not match Galen, the body must be wrong. Vesalius changed this. He got his hands dirty. He cut open bodies himself, and quickly found discrepancies. Galen described the human jaw as 2 bones. It is 1. Galen described a network of blood vessels at the base of the brain, called the rete mirabile. It is not there in humans. Galen described the sternum as 7 segments. It has 3. Over and over, Galen descriptions matched animal anatomy, not human. In 1543, at 28, Vesalius published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. The illustrations are stunning, probably from the workshop of Titian. More than 200 corrections to Galen. His former teacher Jacobus Silvius called him a madman and argued that the human body must have changed since Galen time. But Vesalius was right, and he established the principle that if you want to understand the human body, you have to look at the human body. And once you could see the body clearly, you could ask how it works. Which brings us to William Harvey and the circulation of blood. Before Harvey, the accepted view was that blood was produced in the liver from food, flowed outward through the veins, and was consumed by the tissues. It did not circulate. Harvey, born in 1578 in Folkestone, studied at Padua, where he learned from Hieronymus Fabricius, who had described the valves inside veins, little flaps allowing blood to flow in one direction only, toward the heart. Harvey asked a devastating question. If blood in the veins only flows toward the heart, then Galen model cannot be right. And then Harvey did the math. He estimated the heart pumps about 2 ounces per beat, roughly 72 beats per minute. That is over 500 pounds of blood per hour. The liver cannot manufacture 500 pounds of new blood every hour. The only explanation is that the same blood goes around in a circle. Harvey published in 1628 and faced fierce opposition. Some of his colleagues stopped referring patients to him, and his medical practice actually declined after the book came out. The irony is painful. Here was a man who had made one of the most important discoveries in the history of biology, and his reward was professional ostracism. But Harvey had the temperament to endure it. He was patient, methodical, and above all, confident in his evidence. He had spent over 20 years gathering data before publishing. He had demonstrated his findings in lectures and private demonstrations. He had anticipated every objection and prepared responses. And in the end, the evidence was simply too strong to resist. Within a generation, Harvey's model of circulation was accepted throughout Europe. The old Galenic model was abandoned, and the principle that Harvey had championed, that medical theories must be based on systematic observation and experiment rather than on authority and tradition, became the foundation of modern medical science. The one gap in his argument, how blood got from arteries to veins, was filled in 1661 by Marcello Malpighi, who used a microscope to see capillaries in a frog lungs for the first time, and the microscope was about to change everything. But let us take a moment to appreciate the microscope itself, because its invention opened up a world that nobody had imagined existed. The first person to truly reveal that world was a Dutch tradesman named Antony van Leeuwenhoek, who was not a scientist in any formal sense. He was a fabric merchant in Delft who taught himself to grind lenses as a hobby, and he got extraordinarily good at it. His lenses were tiny, some no bigger than a pinhead, but they were the best in the world, capable of magnifications that no one else could achieve. And through those lenses, starting in the 1670s, he saw things that no human being had ever seen before. He looked at a drop of pond water and found it teeming with tiny living creatures, swimming, spinning, darting. He called them animalcules, little animals. He looked at scrapings from his own teeth and saw bacteria, hundreds of years before anyone understood what they were or what they did. He examined blood and saw individual red blood cells. He looked at muscle fibers, sperm cells, the structure of wood and bone. He wrote letters to the Royal Society in London, describing his findings. Letters that were initially met with disbelief. How could there be tiny living creatures everywhere, in every drop of water, on every surface? It seemed absurd. But Leeuwenhoek was meticulous, and when other scientists finally obtained lenses good enough to replicate his observations, they confirmed everything he had described. Think about what that means. For all of human history, people had no idea that they were surrounded by an invisible world of microscopic life, that the water they drank, the food they ate, the air they breathed, the surfaces they touched, were all populated by organisms too small to see. That world had been there all along, shaping human health and disease in ways no one could have imagined. The microscope did not just reveal new facts, it revealed a new reality, and medicine would never be the same. By the mid-17th century, medicine had broken free from Galenic authority. Vesalius had shown us the real anatomy. Harvey had shown us how blood circulates, but there was still a huge, gaping hole in medical understanding. Nobody knew why people actually get sick. The humoral theory was dying, but nothing had replaced it. Fevers, infections, epidemics, all killing people by the millions, and nobody had any idea what was causing them. The answer was, quite literally, too small to see. The story of germ theory, the idea that many diseases are caused by tiny living organisms invisible to the naked eye, is one of the most dramatic chapters in all of science, and it begins with a tragic figure whose story might be the most heartbreaking in the entire history of medicine. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis, and he was a Hungarian physician working in the maternity ward of the Vienna General Hospital in the 1840s. The problem he was trying to solve was one that haunted hospitals across Europe: childbed fever, also called puerperal fever. Women would come into the hospital to deliver their babies, the delivery would go fine, and then, a day or two later, the mother would develop a raging fever. Within days, she would be dead. The mortality rate in some maternity wards was horrifying: 10, 15, even 30%. Women knew the odds. Some begged not to be taken to the hospital. They preferred to deliver in the streets. The Vienna General Hospital had 2 maternity clinics. The first clinic was staffed by doctors and medical students. The second clinic was staffed by midwives. And here is the thing that was driving Semmelweis crazy. The mortality rate in the first clinic was 2 to 3 times higher than in the second clinic. Women knew this. They pleaded to be admitted to the second clinic. Some deliberately delayed their arrival so they would deliver before reaching the hospital and be sent to the midwife ward. Semmelweis was obsessed with figuring out why. He systematically eliminated possible explanations. Both clinics used the same techniques, the same linens, the same ventilation. The women were from the same population. Climate, diet, overcrowding. None of it explained the difference. And then, in 1847, a tragedy gave him the clue he needed. His friend and colleague, Jakob Kolechka, died after being accidentally cut with a scalpel during an autopsy. Kolechka autopsy revealed the same pathology as women who died of childbed fever. Semmelweis made the connection immediately. The doctors and medical students in the first clinic went directly from performing autopsies, cutting open dead bodies, to examining women in labor. They were carrying something on their hands, some kind of cadaverous particle, from the dead to the living. The midwives in the second clinic never performed autopsies. That was the difference. Semmelweis instituted a simple rule. Before examining any patient, doctors had to wash their hands in a chlorinated lime solution. The results were immediate and dramatic. The mortality rate in the first clinic plummeted. In some months, it dropped to below 1%. He was right, demonstrably, measurably, life-savingly right, and the medical establishment destroyed him for it. His superiors were hostile. The broader medical community was offended. Semmelweis was implying that doctors were killing their own patients with their dirty hands. Without a theoretical framework to explain how invisible particles on your hands could cause disease, germ theory did not exist yet. His findings were dismissed. He was denied a promotion. His contract was not renewed. He became increasingly frustrated and bitter. He wrote angry open letters to prominent obstetricians, calling them murderers. His mental health deteriorated. In 1865, at the age of 47, he was committed to a mental asylum by colleagues. He died there 2 weeks later, possibly from beatings by guards, possibly from infection. The cruel irony being that the very type of infection he had spent his career trying to prevent may have been what killed him in the end. It is one of the most tragic stories in all of medicine. A man who was right, who had the evidence, who could have saved countless lives if anyone had listened, destroyed by institutional arrogance and the inability of the medical profession to accept that its own practices were lethal. There is a term for what happened to Semmelweis. It is called the Semmelweis reflex, the tendency of people to reject new evidence that contradicts established norms or beliefs, especially when accepting that evidence would mean admitting you were wrong, especially when it would mean admitting you had caused harm. It is named after him because his story is such a perfect, heartbreaking example. But the pattern shows up everywhere in the history of medicine. Doctors rejecting anesthesia because they believed pain was necessary for healing. Surgeons mocking the idea that they should wash their hands. Physicians dismissing the evidence that smoking causes cancer because so many of them smoked. The medical profession has an extraordinary capacity for self-deception, and the reason is not stupidity. It is the opposite. It is the fact that medical training produces people who are highly intelligent, highly educated, and deeply invested in a specific body of knowledge, which makes them exceptionally resistant to information that undermines that investment. Changing your mind is hard for anyone. Changing your mind when it means admitting you have been killing your patients is almost impossible. The vindication came through Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Pasteur, a French chemist who was not even a physician, started with problems in the wine and beer industry, why some batches went sour. He discovered that fermentation was caused by living microorganisms, yeasts, and souring by bacteria. He demolished the ancient idea of spontaneous generation through elegant swan-necked flask experiments. And then he made the leap. If microorganisms cause fermentation, could they also cause disease? But before we follow Pasteur into vaccines, we need to talk about Edward Jenner, because the vaccine story actually starts in 1796. Smallpox was one of the great killers of history. It killed roughly 300 million people in the 20th century alone. In 18th century Europe, it killed about 400,000 people a year and was the leading cause of blindness. There was no treatment. If you caught it, your chances of dying were about 1 in 3. Country people in England had long noticed something curious. Milkmaids who had caught cowpox, a much milder disease they picked up from infected cows, seemed to be immune to smallpox. Edward Jenner, a country physician in Gloucestershire, took this folk wisdom seriously. In May 1796, Jenner took material from a cowpox sore on the hand of a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms and inoculated it into the arm of an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. The boy developed a mild cowpox reaction and recovered. Then, 6 weeks later, Jenner inoculated Phipps with actual smallpox material. The boy did not get sick. He was immune. Jenner published his findings in 1798, coining the term vaccination from vacca, the Latin word for cow. Vaccination spread across the world. And in 1980, the World Health Organization declared smallpox officially eradicated from the face of the earth, the first and, so far, only human disease to be completely eliminated through deliberate medical intervention. From a milkmaid and a country doctor to the eradication of humanity's oldest killer. That is medicine at its most magnificent. But smallpox eradication did not happen easily or quickly. It took nearly 2 centuries of global effort. The final campaign, launched by the WHO in 1967, was an extraordinary feat of logistics, politics, and sheer determination. Teams of vaccinators fanned out across the most remote regions of Africa and South Asia, traveling by jeep, by boat, by foot, tracking down every last case, vaccinating everyone in the vicinity, creating rings of immunity that starved the virus of new hosts. The last natural case of smallpox occurred in Somalia in 1977. A hospital cook named Ali Mau Malin, who survived the disease and went on to spend the rest of his life working on polio eradication campaigns. He died in 2013 of malaria while working on a vaccination drive. Think about the arc of that one life, from the last victim of one eradicated disease to a foot soldier in the campaign against the next. And here is something that might surprise you. The techniques Jenner used were not actually the first form of inoculation against smallpox. Long before Jenner, people in China, India, and the Ottoman Empire practiced a technique called variolation, deliberately exposing healthy people to material from mild smallpox cases to induce a less dangerous form of the disease and produce immunity. It was risky. About 2 to 3% of variolated patients died, compared to 30% of those who caught smallpox naturally, but it was widely practiced. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, observed variolation in Constantinople in 1717 and championed its introduction in Britain. She had her own children variolated, and the practice gradually spread through the British aristocracy, though it faced fierce opposition from both the medical establishment and the church. So when Jenner introduced his safer cowpox-based vaccination in 1796, he was building on a tradition of deliberate inoculation that stretched back centuries and across continents. The idea of deliberately provoking the body immune system to prepare it for a future threat, which is the fundamental principle of all vaccination, was not invented by any one person. It emerged independently, in multiple cultures, born from the same desperate observation: those who survived the disease did not get it again. Pasteur took Jenner principle and extended it enormously. He figured out how to artificially weaken or attenuate the organisms that cause disease, creating vaccines from the pathogens themselves. His most dramatic demonstration came in 1881 with anthrax. In a public experiment at Pouilly-le-Fort, he vaccinated 25 sheep with his attenuated anthrax vaccine, left 25 unvaccinated, and exposed all 50 to virulent anthrax. All 25 vaccinated sheep survived. All 25 unvaccinated died or were dying. Then came rabies. In 1885, a 9-year-old boy named Joseph Meister, bitten by a rabid dog, was brought to Pasteur. Rabies was essentially 100% fatal once symptoms appeared. Pasteur treated the boy with his experimental vaccine. Meister survived. Pasteur became a national hero, and the Pasteur Institute, founded in 1888, remains one of the most important biomedical institutions in the world. And there is a beautiful coda to the Joseph Meister story. Meister survived and grew up to become the gatekeeper at the Pasteur Institute. He spent his working life at the institution founded by the man who saved his life, watching over the building, greeting visitors, tending the grounds. When the Nazis occupied Paris in 1940, German soldiers demanded access to Pasteur Crypt in the institute basement. Meister, then 64 years old, refused to let them in. Rather than comply, he took his own life. Whether this story is entirely accurate is debated by historians. Some details may have been embellished over the years, but the core of it, a man spending his life in devotion to the institution that saved him as a child, is well documented and deeply moving. But while Pasteur was the showman, the public face of germ theory, it was Robert Koch who provided the rigorous, systematic methodology that turned germ theory from a compelling idea into a proven science. Koch was a German physician working in a small town in what is now Poland, far from any major research institution. He set up a laboratory in his home, using equipment his wife had given him as a birthday present, including a microscope, and he taught himself the techniques of microbiology from scratch. In 1876, Koch proved that the bacterium Bacillus anthracis causes anthrax. He did not just show the bacteria were present in sick animals. He isolated the bacteria in pure culture, grew them outside the body, injected them into healthy animals, watched those animals get sick, and then recovered the same bacteria from the newly sick animals. This chain of evidence, isolate, culture, infect, re-isolate, became formalized as Koch postulates, and they remain the gold standard for proving that a specific microorganism causes a specific disease. Koch postulates seem obvious in retrospect, but at the time they were revolutionary because they provided a rigorous, reproducible method for establishing causation. Before Koch, the link between a microorganism and a disease was often speculative, based on correlation rather than proof. After Koch, there was a clear, testable standard, and that standard led to an explosion of discovery. Then Koch went after the biggest killer of all, tuberculosis. TB was the leading cause of death in Europe in the 19th century. It killed 1 in every 4 Europeans. In 1882, he identified the bacterium Mycobacterium tuberculosis as the cause. He announced his findings on March 24, 1882, at a meeting of the Berlin Physiological Society. March 24th is still observed as World Tuberculosis Day. Koch won the Nobel Prize in 1905, and Koch achievements extended beyond tuberculosis and anthrax. He traveled to Egypt and India to study cholera, identified the bacterium Vibrio cholerae as the cause, and showed that it was spread through contaminated water. His work on cholera directly led to the great public health interventions of the late 19th century, the water treatment systems and sewerage networks that transformed cities from disease incubators into relatively safe places to live. He also trained an entire generation of microbiologists who went on to identify the causes of dozens of other infectious diseases: diphtheria, typhoid, tetanus, plague, pneumonia, one after another in rapid succession. The period from about 1875 to 1910 is sometimes called the Golden Age of microbiology, and it is not an exaggeration. In the space of a single generation, scientists identified the specific causes of diseases that had been killing people for centuries. The transformation was breathtaking. In 1870, the cause of virtually no infectious disease was known. By 1910, the causes of most major infectious diseases had been identified, and the groundwork for preventing and eventually treating them was firmly in place. Now all the threads come together. If disease is caused by specific microorganisms, then you can fight disease by fighting those organisms. That insight leads to 3 of the most important practical advances in medical history: antiseptic surgery, public health infrastructure, and eventually antibiotics. Joseph Lister was a British surgeon working in Glasgow in the 1860s. Surgery in the mid-19th century was a grim affair. Surgeons operated in their street clothes, often wearing the same blood-encrusted frock coat for years as a badge of experience. They did not wash their hands, they did not sterilize instruments. Post-surgical infection rates were catastrophic. Up to 50% of amputation patients died from infection. Some surgeons called the pus that oozed from infected wounds laudable pus, believing it was a sign of healing. It was not. It was a sign the patient was being consumed by bacteria. Lister read Pasteur work on germ theory and made the connection. If microorganisms cause infection, then preventing them from reaching the wound should prevent infection. Starting in 1865, Lister began using carbolic acid as an antiseptic. He sprayed it on wounds, soaked dressings in it, even sprayed it into the air. The death rate from infection after amputation dropped from about 46% to 15%. Like Semmelweis, Lister faced resistance. But now there was a theory to back the practice, and the profession eventually came around. By the 1880s and 1890s, antiseptic surgery had evolved into aseptic surgery, the idea of creating a completely sterile environment. The modern operating room is the direct descendant of Lister carbolic acid spray, and germ theory transformed public health on a massive scale. If cholera is caused by a bacterium spread through contaminated water, clean the water supply. If typhoid spreads through sewage, build proper sewerage systems. The great public health reforms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, clean water, proper sanitation, food safety regulations, quarantine procedures, saved far more lives than any individual drug or surgical technique. Some historians argue the single most important medical intervention in human history is not penicillin, not vaccination, but the humble sewer pipe. Clean water and proper sanitation have probably prevented more deaths than everything else in medicine combined. And the story of how that happened is worth knowing, even briefly, because it illustrates a point that is easy to forget. The great sanitation reforms were not driven primarily by doctors. They were driven by engineers, by public officials, by social reformers, who saw the connection between poverty, squalor, and disease, and demanded that governments act. In London, the so-called Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames was so polluted with raw sewage that Parliament could not sit because the smell was unbearable, finally prompted the construction of a modern sewerage system designed by the engineer Joseph Bazalgette. His system of intercepting sewers, which captured sewage before it reached the Thames and diverted it downstream, was one of the greatest public health interventions in history. Cholera deaths in London plummeted, and the principle spread. City after city built sewerage systems, water treatment plants, drainage networks. It was not glamorous work. Nobody won a Nobel Prize for building a sewer, but the humble infrastructure of clean water and waste disposal has saved more lives than any individual doctor, drug, or surgical technique in all of human history. And that is a fact worth remembering, because it reminds us that medicine is not just about what happens in hospitals and laboratories. It is about the systems, the policies, the infrastructure that shape the conditions in which people live. But there was still a critical gap. Once someone was already infected, what could you do? What was needed was a magic bullet, a term coined by Paul Ehrlich, a German physician who spent his career searching for chemical compounds that would kill specific microorganisms without harming the patient. In 1909, after testing hundreds of arsenic-based compounds against the bacterium that causes syphilis, Ehrlich and his colleague Sahachiro Hata found one that worked, compound 606, which they called Salvarsan. It became the first effective antimicrobial drug in history, the first time a chemical substance had been deliberately used to kill a specific pathogen inside a living patient. It was not perfect. Salvarsan was based on arsenic, so it was toxic. The injections were painful, the dosing had to be carefully managed, and the treatment regimen was long and grueling. But it worked. For the first time, medicine had a weapon it could use after infection had already taken hold. The concept of the magic bullet, a chemical that seeks out and destroys the invader while leaving the host unharmed, was born, and it would drive pharmaceutical research for the next century and beyond. Ehrlich himself was a fascinating character, brilliant, eccentric, constantly surrounded by clouds of cigar smoke, his desk buried under mountains of papers and correspondence. He developed many of the staining techniques that Koch and others used to identify bacteria under the microscope, and he made foundational contributions to immunology. He was, in many ways, the father of modern pharmacology, the first person to approach drug development as a systematic, scientific enterprise, rather than a matter of folklore and guesswork. But the real magic bullet came from an entirely different direction, and its discovery is one of those stories so perfectly improbable it almost feels scripted. Alexander Fleming was working at St. Mary Hospital in London in September 1928. He was studying Staphylococcus bacteria, and he had a habit that drove his colleagues slightly crazy. He was messy. He left petri dishes lying around, often for weeks. He went on holiday and left his bacterial cultures sitting out. And when he came back, he noticed something peculiar. A mold had contaminated one of the plates, and around the mold, the bacteria had died. There was a clear ring where no bacteria could grow. Fleming identified the mold as Penicillium notatum and called the antibacterial substance it produced penicillin. He published a paper about it in 1929, and then, essentially, nothing happened. For over a decade, Fleming could not produce penicillin in any useful quantity and was not a chemist. It took a war to change that. In 1939, Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain at Oxford picked up Fleming work. They grew the mold in bedpans and bathtubs. They first tested it on a human patient, a policeman named Albert Alexander, who was dying of a bacterial infection from a scratch on his face. In February 1941, within hours of receiving penicillin, Alexander fever dropped, his appetite returned, his infection began to clear. But they ran out of penicillin. They even recycled it from Alexander urine. It was not enough. The infection came back, and Alexander died. But the principle was proven. Florey traveled to the United States and enlisted American pharmaceutical companies in a massive production effort. By D-Day, in June 1944, there was enough penicillin to treat every wounded Allied soldier who needed it. Infections that had been death sentences for all of human history were now curable with an injection. Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the Nobel Prize in 1945. The story of penicillin production during the war is itself a remarkable chapter. The initial yields were pitiful. The Oxford team grew mold on the surface of liquid medium in shallow containers, hundreds of bedpans and baking dishes filling every available space in their laboratory. A single patient dose required about 2,000 liters of mold culture. When Florey brought the project to America, scientists at the USDA Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria, Illinois, discovered that using corn steep liquor, a waste product of corn processing, as a growth medium dramatically increased penicillin yields. They also found a more productive strain of the mold on a cantaloupe bought from a local fruit market. That cantaloupe mold, Penicillium chrysogenum, became the ancestor of virtually all penicillin-producing strains used worldwide. From a rotting cantaloupe in a Peoria grocery store to a global pharmaceutical industry, the history of medicine is full of moments where the world-changing and the mundane intersect in ways that are almost comically improbable. And it is worth pausing to note what penicillin meant to the soldiers who received it. Before antibiotics, a battlefield wound was terrifyingly dangerous, not because of the initial injury. A bullet wound or a piece of shrapnel could often be survived, but because of the infection that followed. Gangrene, septicemia, tetanus, these were the real killers of war. In World War I, infected wounds killed more soldiers than combat itself. In World War II, with penicillin available, the death rate from infected wounds dropped dramatically. Soldiers who would have died in 1917 survived in 1944. The psychological impact was enormous too. For the first time, soldiers going into battle knew that if they were wounded and made it to a field hospital, there was a drug that could save them from infection. That knowledge changed the experience of combat in ways that are hard to quantify, but impossible to overstate. Fleming warned in his Nobel lecture that bacteria could become resistant to penicillin if the drug was used improperly. He described how easy it was to produce resistant bacteria in the laboratory. He was describing, in 1945, the problem of antibiotic resistance, now one of the most serious threats to global health. But in the late 1940s and 1950s, nobody was worrying about that. Penicillin's success triggered an explosion of antibiotic discovery. Streptomycin, the first drug effective against tuberculosis, chloramphenicol, tetracycline, erythromycin. It was a golden age. Some physicians genuinely believed that infectious disease could be conquered entirely. They were wrong. The optimism was understandable, but premature. Fleming warning was coming true. MISR appeared. Multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis, resistant gonorrhea, and the pipeline of new antibiotics slowed. Pharmaceutical companies found chronic disease drugs more profitable. The WHO now calls antibiotic resistance one of the greatest threats to global health. Over 1 million people die annually from resistant infections. And here is what makes this so frustrating. We know why resistance develops, Fleming told us in 1945. Bacteria reproduce incredibly fast. A single bacterium can become 1 million in less than a day, and every reproduction is a chance for a random mutation. Most mutations are neutral or harmful to the bacterium, but occasionally, purely by chance, a mutation will make a bacterium slightly more resistant to an antibiotic. In a world without antibiotics, that mutation does not matter much. But in a world saturated with antibiotics, a world where antibiotics are prescribed for viral infections they cannot treat, where they are fed to livestock, not because the animals are sick, but to make them grow faster, where they are available over the counter in many countries, and people take them for a day or two, and then stop when they feel better, leaving the most resistant bacteria alive and ready to multiply. In that world, resistance is not a possibility. It is an inevitability. We are, in effect, conducting a massive evolutionary experiment, and the bacteria are winning. Every time you take an antibiotic you do not need, every time a farmer feeds antibiotics to healthy cattle, every time a patient stops their course of treatment early, the selective pressure increases, the resistant survive, the susceptible die, and the proportion of resistant bacteria in the world ticks upward. One prescription, one feedlot, one incomplete course at a time. But let us not stay in that dark place too long, because alongside the story of antibiotics, the 20th century saw medical advances on so many other fronts that it is almost overwhelming to catalog them. Let us talk about surgery, because the story of surgery is, in many ways, a story about two barriers, and they were both broken in the 19th century. Those two barriers were pain and infection. We have already talked about infection, Lister, and antisepsis. But the pain barrier came first, and its fall is one of the most dramatic moments in medical history. Before anesthesia, surgery was pure agony. The patient was fully conscious, held down by strong assistants, screaming, writhing, sometimes biting down on a leather strap. The surgeon's most valued skill was speed. The faster you could cut, the less the patient suffered. Robert Liston, a famous London surgeon of the 1840s, could amputate a leg in under 30 seconds. He was so fast that he once accidentally amputated his assistant fingers during an operation. The assistant later died of infection. The patient also died of infection. And a spectator reportedly died of shock from watching, making it what some medical historians have called the only operation in history with a 300% mortality rate. That story may be embellished, but the underlying reality is not. The first successful public demonstration of surgical anesthesia took place on October 16, 1846, at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, in a surgical amphitheater now known as the Ether Dome. A dentist named William Morton administered diethyl ether to a patient named Edward Abbott, and the surgeon, John Collins Warren, removed a tumor from Abbott's neck while Abbott lay unconscious and pain-free. When Warren finished, he turned to the audience and reportedly said, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." That moment, Ether Day, as it came to be called, is one of the landmark events in the history of medicine. It did not just change surgery, It changed the entire relationship between medicine and suffering. And it changed it profoundly, because without anesthesia, the surgeon was always in a race against agony. You could not take your time. You could not be precise. You could not explore or investigate. You cut fast and got out. Anesthesia removed the time constraint. It allowed surgeons to work slowly, carefully, methodically. It made possible procedures that would have been unthinkable when the patient was screaming and struggling. Operations deep inside the abdomen, delicate repairs to blood vessels and nerves, reconstructive work that required hours of painstaking precision. It also changed the patient relationship with surgery. Before anesthesia, people avoided surgery at all costs, choosing to live with hernias, tumors, and chronic pain, rather than submit to the horror of the operating table. After anesthesia, surgery became something you could consent to without facing the prospect of the worst pain you would ever experience. The psychological barrier was almost as important as the physical one. The history of who deserves credit for anesthesia is messy and contentious. Crawford Long had used ether as early as 1842, but did not publish. Horace Wells demonstrated nitrous oxide in 1845, but the demonstration went badly. Morton was partly inspired by his chemistry professor, Charles Jackson. The aftermath was a bitter, decades-long priority dispute that consumed all the claimants. Morton died in 1868, aged 48, broke and exhausted. Wells had already died in 1848, by suicide, in a New York jail cell. It is one of those stories where the discovery itself is a beautiful gift to humanity, and the human drama surrounding it is utterly tragic. But anesthesia, combined with antisepsis, opened up the interior of the human body to surgery. Procedures that had been unthinkable became possible. And in the 20th century, surgery achieved feats that would have seemed like science fiction. One of the most dramatic was organ transplantation. The first successful kidney transplant was performed in 1954 by Joseph Murray at Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston. The donor and recipient were identical twins, Richard and Ronald Herrick, so there was no immune rejection. Ronald donated one of his kidneys, and Richard survived with the transplanted organ for 8 years. Murray won the Nobel Prize in 1990. But identical twins are rare. Transplanting between unrelated people required defeating the immune system. The breakthrough came with immunosuppressive drugs. Azathioprine in the early 1960s was the first. Cyclosporine, discovered in a soil sample from Norway in 1971 and introduced clinically in the 1980s, was far better and transformed transplant medicine. Kidney, liver, lung, and heart transplants all became viable. The first human heart transplant captivated the entire world. On December 3, 1967, in Cape Town, South Africa, Christiaan Barnard removed the heart of a young woman who had died in a car accident and placed it in the chest of Louis Washkansky, who was dying of heart failure. The operation took 9 hours. Washkansky survived for 18 days before dying of pneumonia. Barnard became the most famous surgeon on Earth overnight, but the early results were sobering. Without better immunosuppression, most heart transplant recipients died within weeks or months. It was cyclosporin in the 1980s that made heart transplantation a practical, life-saving procedure rather than a headline-grabbing experiment. And transplantation continued to evolve in ways that would have astonished Barnard. Today, surgeons can transplant not just hearts and kidneys, but faces, hands, even uteruses. In 2014, a Swedish woman became the first person to give birth using a transplanted uterus, the organ donated by a family friend. The child, a healthy boy, was delivered by cesarean section, and the story made headlines around the world. But perhaps the most remarkable development is the growing field of xenotransplantation, using organs from animals, particularly genetically modified pigs, to solve the chronic shortage of human donor organs. In January 2022, a man named David Bennett received a genetically modified pig heart at the University of Maryland Medical Center. The pig had been engineered to remove genes that trigger human immune rejection and to add human genes that promote compatibility. Bennett survived for 2 months before dying of heart failure, and while the outcome was not a long-term success, the fact that a pig heart functioned in a human body for that long was a remarkable proof of concept. Thousands of people die every year waiting for organ transplants. If xenotransplantation can be made to work reliably, it could end the organ shortage entirely. And while surgeons were learning to transplant organs, another revolution was transforming medicine from an entirely different direction, one that did not involve cutting at all, seeing inside the living body without opening it up. Medical imaging. In November 1895, Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, a German physicist, was experimenting with cathode rays when he noticed something strange. A fluorescent screen across the room was glowing. Something invisible was passing through the air and through solid objects. He called them X-rays. He found that they could pass through flesh but were blocked by bone and metal. And on December 22, 1895, he took the most famous photograph in the history of medicine, an X-ray image of his wife Anna Bertha Hand, showing the bones and her wedding ring. She reportedly said, "I have seen my death." The impact was instantaneous. Within weeks, X-rays were being used in hospitals around the world. Röntgen won the very first Nobel Prize in Physics in 1901, and he donated the prize money, refusing to patent the technology so it would be freely available. But X-rays also had a dark side that took years to become apparent. The early experimenters had no idea that X-ray radiation was dangerous. Researchers and technicians exposed themselves to massive doses, sometimes holding patients in position with their bare hands while the machine ran. Thomas Edison assistant Clarence Daly, who had worked extensively with X-ray tubes, developed severe radiation burns, lost both arms to amputation, and died of metastatic cancer in 1904. Edison himself abandoned X-ray research after Daly's death, saying he was afraid of the rays. Marie Curie, whose work on radioactivity earned her 2 Nobel Prizes, died in 1934 of aplastic anemia, almost certainly caused by decades of radiation exposure. Her laboratory notebooks are still so radioactive they must be kept in lead-lined boxes, and anyone who wants to consult them must wear protective clothing. The story of X-rays is a reminder that medical progress sometimes exacts a terrible price from the people who make it possible, and that the full consequences of a new technology may not be understood for years or decades after its introduction. X-rays were just the beginning. Ultrasound, developed for medical use in the 1950s, uses sound waves to create images of soft tissues. CT scanning, developed by Godfrey Hounsfield and Alan Cormack in the early 1970s, combined X-rays with computer processing for detailed cross-sections. MRI, developed by Paul Lauterbur and Peter Mansfield in the 1970s and 1980s, uses magnetic fields and radio waves for incredibly detailed soft tissue images without any radiation. An MRI of the brain is one of the most beautiful things in modern medicine. Every fold and fissure of the cortex visible, tumors and lesions lit up like beacons against the gray and white matter. These technologies did not just help diagnosis, they changed surgery itself. Surgeons could plan operations in advance. Interventional radiology emerged, threading catheters through blood vessels guided by real-time imaging. The era of exploratory surgery, cutting someone open just to see what was going on, was essentially over. And imaging technology continues to advance in ways that blur the line between diagnosis and science fiction. PET scans can show metabolic activity in the brain, lighting up regions that are active during specific tasks or emotions, giving us the first real-time maps of thought itself. Functional MRI can detect changes in blood flow associated with neural activity, allowing researchers to identify which brain regions are involved in memory, language, decision-making, and emotion. These tools are not just diagnostic. They are changing our understanding of what the brain is and how it works, opening up new approaches to treating neurological and psychiatric conditions. And at the molecular level, new imaging techniques can track individual molecules inside living cells, watching in real time as proteins fold, as DNA replicates, as cells divide and communicate. We can now see the machinery of life at a resolution that Leeuwenhoek could not have imagined. And every improvement in our ability to see brings with it new possibilities for understanding and treating disease. And there is one more tool worth mentioning, one that does not produce images, but has arguably saved more lives than any imaging technology. The humble stethoscope, invented in 1816 by French physician René Laennec, who was too embarrassed to press his ear directly against a young female patient chest, and instead rolled up a sheet of paper into a tube to listen through. He found that the tube amplified the sounds of the heart and lungs, and he went on to develop a wooden instrument specifically for the purpose. The stethoscope became the symbol of the physician, the tool that every doctor carries, and for 2 centuries it was the primary means by which physicians listened to the interior of the living body. It is a beautifully simple technology, and it reminds us that medical progress does not always require billion-dollar machines. Sometimes, a rolled-up piece of paper is enough. And let us pause here to talk about something that often gets overlooked in histories of medicine, the development of our understanding of the mind. Because for most of human history, mental illness was understood even less than physical illness, and treated even more cruelly. People with psychiatric conditions were chained, imprisoned, starved, beaten, exorcised. They were believed to be possessed by demons, cursed by God, morally deficient. The institutions that housed them, the asylums, were often places of unimaginable cruelty, where patients were kept in conditions worse than prisons, chained to walls, locked in cages, subjected to treatments that were essentially torture. The first real reformer was a French physician named Philippe Pinel, who in 1793, during the French Revolution, ordered the chains removed from patients at the Bicêtre Asylum in Paris. It was a radical act. The prevailing wisdom was that the mentally ill were dangerous animals who needed to be restrained. Pinel argued they were sick people who needed care and compassion. He called his approach moral treatment, humane conditions, meaningful activity, dignity. And it worked. Patients who had been violent and unmanageable calmed down when treated like human beings. Similar reforms were championed by William Tuke in England, who founded the York Retreat in 1796, and by Dorothea Dix in America, who campaigned tirelessly in the mid-19th century for better treatment of the mentally ill, personally lobbying state legislatures and documenting the horrific conditions she found in jails and poorhouses where the mentally ill were confined. But the history of psychiatry also contains some of medicine's darkest chapters. Lobotomy, the surgical destruction of brain tissue to treat mental illness, was developed in the 1930s by Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz, who won the Nobel Prize for it in 1949. Walter Freeman, an American neurologist, developed a technique he called the ice pick lobotomy, which involved inserting a sharp instrument through the eye socket into the brain. He did not have formal surgical training. He performed the procedure in his office, often without proper anesthesia, sometimes on children. He lobotomized over 3,000 patients. The results were frequently devastating. Patients left permanently disabled, reduced to childlike states, stripped of their personalities and emotions. It is one of the starkest reminders in all of medicine that desperation and good intentions are not substitutes for understanding. The real transformation of psychiatric treatment came with the accidental discovery of psychiatric medications in the 1950s. Chlorpromazine, originally developed as an antihistamine, was found to dramatically reduce psychotic symptoms, hallucinations, delusions, disordered thinking. It was the first antipsychotic, and its introduction in 1954 emptied the long-stay psychiatric wards that had warehoused millions of people. Then came the antidepressants. First the MAOIs, then the tricyclics, then the SSRIs like fluoxetine, sold as Prozac, which arrived in 1988 and became one of the most prescribed medications in history. Lithium, first used to treat mania in 1949 by Australian psychiatrist John Cade, who had discovered its calming effect almost by accident while testing it on guinea pigs, remains one of the most effective treatments for bipolar disorder over 70 years later. These drugs did not cure mental illness. They managed it. But management made an enormous difference in millions of lives, allowing people to leave institutions, hold jobs, maintain relationships, live with dignity in their communities. But it is important to be honest about the limitations of psychiatric medication too, because the story of psychiatry is not a simple arc from darkness to light. The deinstitutionalization movement, driven partly by the availability of psychiatric drugs and partly by revelations about the horrific conditions in many institutions, closed hundreds of psychiatric hospitals across the United States and Europe in the 1960s and 1970s. The intention was that patients would be treated in the community, with outpatient care and medication. But the community services were often inadequate or non-existent. Many people with serious mental illness ended up homeless, in prison, or cycling through emergency rooms. The number of people with mental illness in American jails and prisons today dwarfs the population of the old state hospitals. We emptied the asylums, but we did not build the alternative. And the medications themselves, while often effective, come with significant side effects: weight gain, metabolic changes, movement disorders, emotional blunting, that many patients find intolerable. Finding the right medication at the right dose for a particular individual remains as much art as science, a process of trial and error that can take months or years. And our understanding of mental illness itself remains frustratingly incomplete. We do not have a complete model of how the brain produces consciousness, emotion, or thought, which means we do not have a complete understanding of how those processes can go wrong. The chemical imbalance theory of depression, the idea that depression is simply caused by low serotonin levels, has been widely popularized, but is almost certainly an oversimplification. Depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. These are complex conditions involving genetics, neurobiology, psychology, and social circumstances, and reducing them to a simple chemical equation does a disservice to the people who live with them. The history of psychiatry is, in many ways, a microcosm of the entire history of medicine. A slow, painful, often 2 steps forward, 1 step back journey, from ignorance toward understanding, marked by genuine breakthroughs, terrible mistakes, and the constant humbling recognition that the thing we are trying to understand is far more complex than we thought. Now, let us come back to the main thread, because the revolution that may ultimately dwarf all of these, the one whose consequences we can barely begin to imagine, began in a quiet laboratory in Cambridge, England, on a February morning in 1953, when two young scientists realized they had discovered the structure of the molecule that contains the instructions for building every living thing on Earth. Their names were James Watson and Francis Crick, and the molecule was DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. The story of the discovery is complicated and not entirely heroic. The crucial X-ray crystallography data that revealed DNA helical structure was produced by Rosalind Franklin at King College London, and the way Watson and Crick gained access to that data, through Franklin colleague Maurice Wilkins, without her full knowledge or consent, is one of the more uncomfortable episodes in the history of science. Franklin died of ovarian cancer in 1958 at the age of 37, possibly caused by her extensive exposure to X-rays during her research, and she never received the Nobel Prize that Watson, Crick, and Wilkins shared in 1962. But the discovery itself was transformative beyond anything they could have imagined. DNA is the instruction manual for life. Every cell in your body contains the complete set of instructions, about 3 billion base pairs, arranged on 23 pairs of chromosomes, for building and operating a human being. Understanding its structure opened the door to understanding heredity, genetic disease, evolution, and eventually, the ability to read, edit, and rewrite the code of life itself. The medical implications unfolded over decades. In the 1970s, recombinant DNA technology allowed scientists to splice genes from one organism into another. The first major medical application was the production of human insulin using genetically modified bacteria. Before that, diabetics relied on insulin extracted from pig or cow pancreases. By inserting the human insulin gene into bacteria, pharmaceutical companies could produce unlimited quantities, cheaply and safely. It was approved in 1982. The Human Genome Project, launched in 1990 and completed in 2003, mapped the entire sequence of human DNA. It cost roughly $3 billion and took 13 years. Today, you can have your genome sequenced for under $100 in less than a day. That plummeting cost is opening the door to personalized medicine, treatments tailored to your individual genetic makeup. In cancer treatment, drugs like imatinib target a specific protein produced by a specific chromosomal abnormality in certain leukemias. Before imatinib, chronic myeloid leukemia was a death sentence. With it, most patients live normal lifespans. One drug, targeting one molecular defect, transforming a fatal disease into a manageable condition. That is the power of understanding the genetic basis of disease, and it goes beyond cancer. Pharmacogenomics, the study of how your genes affect your response to drugs, is beginning to transform how medications are prescribed. Some people metabolize certain drugs too quickly, rendering them ineffective. Others metabolize them too slowly, leading to dangerous accumulations and side effects. A simple genetic test can now predict, before you take a single pill, whether a particular drug is likely to work for you or whether it might cause a dangerous reaction. The blood thinner warfarin, for example, has notoriously variable effects depending on genetic variants in two specific enzymes. For decades, doctors had to adjust warfarin doses through trial and error, a process that sometimes led to dangerous bleeding or inadequate clotting. Now, a genetic test can predict the right dose from the start. It is a small example, but it points toward a future in which medicine is no longer one size fits all, in which your treatment is tailored to your unique genetic profile, and in which the trial and error that has characterized drug prescribing for centuries is replaced by precision. And then came CRISPR. In 2012, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuelle Charpentier published a paper describing a system adapted from bacterial immune defenses, that could be used to edit DNA with unprecedented precision. CRISPR-Cas9 acts like molecular scissors, cutting DNA at a specific location and allowing scientists to delete, insert, or modify genes. It was faster, cheaper, and more accurate than any previous gene editing technology, and it set off an explosion of research. In laboratories around the world, scientists began using CRISPR to study gene function, create disease models, develop new therapies, and explore possibilities that had been purely theoretical just a few years earlier. The technology was so powerful and so accessible that even small labs with modest budgets could use it. It democratized genetic engineering in a way that no previous technology had done, and the medical applications were immediately apparent. The medical possibilities are staggering. Genetic diseases caused by single gene mutations, sickle cell disease, cystic fibrosis, Huntington disease, some forms of muscular dystrophy, could potentially be cured by editing the faulty gene. In December 2023, the first CRISPR-based therapy was approved, Casgevy, a treatment for sickle cell disease that edits patients' own blood stem cells to produce functional hemoglobin. It is not a simple process. Patients need chemotherapy to destroy their existing bone marrow before the edited cells are transplanted back. But for people with severe sickle cell disease, who face a lifetime of agonizing pain crises and organ damage, it is transformative. Doudna and Charpentier shared the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2020, but CRISPR also raises profound ethical questions. If you can edit genes in somatic cells, the regular cells of the body, the changes affect only that individual. But if you edit genes in embryos or reproductive cells, the changes are heritable. They get passed on to future generations. In 2018, a Chinese biophysicist named He Jiankui shocked the world by announcing that he had created the first gene-edited babies, twin girls, whose genomes he had modified using CRISPR, supposedly to make them resistant to HIV. The scientific community was appalled, not because the goal was inherently wrong, but because the technology was not ready, the risks were poorly understood, the consent process was questionable, and the entire experiment was conducted in secret, outside any regulatory framework. He Jiankui was sentenced to 3 years in prison. The episode highlighted a truth that runs through the entire history of medicine. The power to heal is inseparable from the power to harm, and the boundary between them depends on wisdom, ethics, and restraint. And this brings us to perhaps the most dramatic medical story of the 21st century so far, and the most vivid illustration of how far medicine has come and how fast it can move when the stakes are high enough. The COVID-19 pandemic. In December 2019, a cluster of unusual pneumonia cases appeared in Wuhan, China. Within weeks, the cause was identified, a novel coronavirus, soon named SARS-CoV-2. By January 2020, the virus' complete genetic sequence had been published and shared globally. Think about that timeline for a second. A brand new pathogen emerges, and within weeks, scientists on the other side of the world know its exact genetic makeup. Robert Koch spent years isolating and identifying the tuberculosis bacterium in the 1880s. The tools of molecular biology compressed that timeline to days. But identifying the virus was only the beginning. The world needed a vaccine, and it needed one fast. And this is where a technology that had been in development for decades, one that many people had never heard of before 2020, stepped into the spotlight: mRNA vaccines. The story of mRNA vaccine technology is inseparable from the story of one person, a Hungarian-born biochemist named Katalin Karikó. And her story, like so many in this history, is one of extraordinary persistence in the face of institutional indifference. Karikó had been working on messenger RNA since the 1980s. Her idea was that instead of injecting a weakened or inactivated virus to trigger an immune response, the way traditional vaccines work, you could inject the mRNA instructions for making a single viral protein. Your own cells would read those instructions, manufacture the protein, display it on their surfaces, and your immune system would learn to recognize and attack it. It was elegant in theory, but plagued by practical problems. Synthetic mRNA triggered a violent inflammatory response. It was fragile and degraded quickly, and funding agencies were not interested. Kariko was repeatedly denied grants. She was demoted at the University of Pennsylvania. She was, by her own account, close to giving up. But she kept working. In 2005, she and her colleague, Drew Weissman, published a breakthrough paper showing that by modifying one of the building blocks of mRNA, replacing uridine with pseudouridine, they could dramatically reduce the inflammatory response. The modified mRNA was tolerated by the body. It worked, and it set the stage for everything that followed. The 2005 paper was largely ignored at the time. It received little attention and few citations in its first years. Kariko and Weissman were working at the margins of their field, pursuing an idea that most of their colleagues considered a dead end. But a handful of researchers recognized the significance of what they had done. Derek Rossi, a stem cell biologist at Harvard, read the paper and was so struck by its implications that he co-founded a company to commercialize mRNA technology. That company was Moderna. Meanwhile, Ugur Sahin and Özlem Türeci, a husband and wife team of Turkish-German scientists, founded BioNTech with a similar vision, developing mRNA therapies initially for cancer, but with an eye toward infectious diseases. These companies would spend the next 15 years quietly building the manufacturing infrastructure and clinical expertise needed to turn modified mRNA from a laboratory curiosity into a viable medical product. When the pandemic arrived, they were ready not by luck, but because a small number of people had believed in the technology when almost no one else did. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the mRNA technology was ready. Both Moderna and BioNTech, partnering with Pfizer, used the Kariko and Weissman modified mRNA approach to develop vaccines against SARS-CoV-2. BioNTech designed its vaccine within days of receiving the viral sequence. Days. The clinical trials were accelerated but rigorous, involving tens of thousands of participants. Both vaccines showed roughly 95% efficacy in preventing symptomatic disease, numbers that stunned even the researchers. The first mRNA COVID vaccine was authorized for emergency use in December 2020, less than a year after the viral sequence was published. In the history of vaccine development, this was unprecedented. Traditional vaccines typically take 10 to 15 years to develop. The mumps vaccine, previously the fastest ever developed, took 4 years. The COVID mRNA vaccines took 11 months, and they worked. By some estimates, COVID vaccines prevented over 14 million deaths worldwide in their first year of use alone. Kariko and Weissman won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2023. And the mRNA platform is now being explored for vaccines against influenza, HIV, malaria, various cancers, and a host of other diseases. The technology that nearly died from lack of funding in the 1990s may turn out to be one of the most important medical innovations of the 21st century. And the COVID pandemic itself, as devastating as it was, revealed something remarkable about the state of modern medicine. The global scientific community responded with a speed and coordination that would have been inconceivable even a generation earlier. Within days of the outbreak, the virus genome was sequenced and shared publicly. Within weeks, diagnostic tests were developed. Within months, Multiple vaccine candidates were in clinical trials. Within a year, effective vaccines were being administered to millions of people. The scale and speed of the response was historically unprecedented, and it was only possible because of the accumulated medical knowledge of centuries. The Jenner tradition of vaccination, the Pasteur tradition of microbiology, the Watson and Crick tradition of molecular biology, the Kariko and Weissman innovation of modified mRNA, all coming together in a moment of urgent need. It was not perfect. The pandemic exposed deep inequities in global health, with wealthy nations hoarding vaccines while poorer nations waited. It revealed the fragility of public trust in science, as misinformation about vaccines spread faster than the virus itself. And it left millions of people with long-lasting health effects that we are still struggling to understand and treat. But it also demonstrated, in the most vivid way possible, what medicine can achieve when the full weight of human knowledge, ingenuity, and political will is brought to bear on a single problem. And there is one more story I want to tell you before we wind down, because it connects the ancient world to the modern one in a way that captures something essential about what medicine is and always has been. It is the story of polio. Poliomyelitis was one of the most feared diseases of the 20th century. It struck mainly children, paralyzing muscles, sometimes permanently, sometimes fatally when it affected the muscles used for breathing. In the summer of 1952, nearly 60,000 children in the United States were infected. Parents were terrified. Public swimming pools were closed. Children were kept indoors. Movie theaters emptied. And the images from that era, iron lungs lined up in hospital wards, rows of children sealed inside metal cylinders that breathed for them because their own chest muscles were paralyzed. Those images are some of the most haunting in the history of medicine. Jonas Salk, a virologist at the University of Pittsburgh, developed the first effective polio vaccine using killed virus. It was tested in one of the largest clinical trials in history, involving 1.8 million children, the so-called polio pioneers. On April 12, 1955, the results were announced. The vaccine was safe and effective. Church bells rang across America. People wept in the streets. Salk became an instant national hero, and when asked who owned the patent on the vaccine, he famously replied, "Well, the people. Could you patent the sun?" He never patented it, and never became wealthy from his discovery. It is estimated that the patent, had he taken it, would have been worth roughly $7 billion in today money. Salk chose principle over profit, and he is remembered for it. Think about that. A man who saved millions of lives, who could have become one of the richest people on earth, chose to give his discovery away because he believed it belonged to humanity. Albert Sabin later developed an oral polio vaccine using live attenuated virus, which was cheaper, easier to administer, just drops on the tongue, and could spread immunization through communities because vaccinated individuals shed the weakened virus to unvaccinated contacts. Between the two vaccines, polio cases plummeted. In 1988, the Global Polio Eradication Initiative was launched. Wild poliovirus type 2 was declared eradicated in 2015, type 3 in 2019. Only type 1 remains, confined to a handful of cases in Afghanistan and Pakistan. We are on the verge of eliminating a second human disease from the face of the earth, following smallpox. And every case prevented, every child who walks and runs and plays because of those vaccines, is a testament to the cumulative power of everything we have talked about tonight. Germ theory, virology, immunology, clinical trials, public health infrastructure, and the stubborn refusal of people like Salk and Sabin to accept that children should die of preventable diseases. and the polio story has one more lesson to teach us, one that is directly relevant to the world you are living in right now. The success of the polio vaccine depended not just on the science, but on public trust. When the Salk vaccine was announced in 1955, there was widespread relief and gratitude. Parents rushed to get their children vaccinated. But just weeks after the announcement, disaster struck. A batch of vaccine, manufactured by Cutter Laboratories in California, contained live, virulent poliovirus due to a manufacturing error. 200,000 children received the defective vaccine. 40,000 developed mild polio. 164 were permanently paralyzed. 10 died. It was called the Cutter incident, and it was a catastrophe that could have destroyed public confidence in vaccination entirely. But it did not. And the reason it did not is instructive. The government responded with transparency, accountability, and improved safety regulations. Cutter Laboratories was held responsible. Manufacturing standards were tightened. Independent testing was strengthened. And the vaccination campaign continued, because the evidence that the vaccine worked was overwhelming, and because the public health authorities maintained credibility by acknowledging the failure and fixing it, rather than denying it or covering it up. Trust was preserved because it was earned through honesty. That is a lesson that resonates far beyond polio and far beyond medicine. Trust is the foundation of public health, and it is built not by claiming perfection, but by demonstrating accountability. And so, here we are, lying in the dark. There is one more thing worth saying before we bring this story to a close, and it is about the people who make medicine work every day, not the famous discoverers whose names fill the history books, but the millions of ordinary people who keep the system running. The nurses who spend 12-hour shifts at bedsides, monitoring vital signs, administering medications, comforting the frightened, cleaning up the mess. The paramedics who arrive at accident scenes and make split-second decisions that determine whether someone lives or dies. The laboratory technicians who process blood samples and cultures. The public health workers who track disease outbreaks and administer vaccines in remote villages. The community health workers who go door to door in neighborhoods where people have no access to clinics. The pharmacists, the physical therapists, the social workers, the home health aides. Medicine is not just a collection of great discoveries. It is a human enterprise, carried out by millions of people whose names will never appear in any history book, and whose daily acts of care and competence and compassion are the living fabric of everything we have talked about tonight. Without them, all the discoveries in the world would be just words on paper. At the far end of a story that stretches back thousands of years, from the priests of ancient Mesopotamia chanting over the sick, to an Egyptian papyrus recommending honey for wounds, to Hippocrates insisting that disease has natural causes, to Galen, confident and confidently wrong treatises that ruled medicine for a millennium, to the Islamic scholars who kept the flame of knowledge alive and added their own brilliance to it, to Vesalius tearing down the old anatomy with his own hands, to Harvey proving that blood circulates in a loop, to Semmelweis dying in an asylum because nobody would listen, to Pasteur and Koch revealing the invisible world of microbes, to Lister carbolic acid and the birth of the sterile operating room, to Fleming messy petri dish and the miracle of penicillin, to the double helix of DNA shimmering in a Cambridge laboratory, to the first heart transplant in Cape Town, to CRISPR editing genes with the precision of molecular scissors, to Catalin Carico mRNA technology, saving millions of lives in a pandemic. It is a long story, and it is full of wrong turns and dead ends, and brilliant people who were ignored, and mediocre people who were celebrated. It is full of suffering, because for most of human history, medicine could not actually do very much, and what it did was often harmful. Bloodletting, mercury treatments, lobotomies, thalidomide. The history of medicine is also a history of terrible mistakes, of confidence outpacing competence, of treatments that were worse than the diseases they were meant to cure. That matters. That is part of the story. The humility to say we were wrong is as important to medical progress as any discovery. But look at where we have arrived. A child born today, in most parts of the world, can expect to live into their 70s or 80s. A child born 200 years ago could expect to reach perhaps 40, and that average was dragged down by staggering rates of infant and childhood mortality. The diseases that once wiped out entire cities, smallpox, plague, cholera, polio, are either eradicated, controlled, or treatable. Surgeons can replace hearts, reattach severed limbs, remove tumors the size of grapefruits with pinpoint precision. Medications can manage diabetes, control blood pressure, suppress HIV to undetectable levels, calm the storms of autoimmune disease. We can see inside the living body without making a single cut. We can read the genetic code of life and are beginning to learn how to rewrite it. None of this was inevitable. None of it was guaranteed. Every step forward required someone willing to challenge what everyone else believed, someone willing to look at the evidence rather than the authority, someone willing to fail and fail and fail and keep going. Semmelweis washing his hands, Jenner trusting the milkmaids, Koch hunched over his microscope in a small-town laboratory, Fleming noticing the clear ring around a bit of mold, Carrico modifying RNA molecules when nobody thought it mattered. And the story is not over, not even close. The challenges ahead are enormous. Antibiotic resistance threatens to undo a century of progress. Cancer remains stubbornly complex. Each tumor its own genetic puzzle. Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative conditions continue to defy our best efforts. The gap in access to medical care between rich nations and poor ones is a moral crisis that dwarfs any scientific challenge. And the ethical questions raised by gene editing, artificial intelligence in diagnosis, and the sheer power of modern biomedicine are only going to get more urgent and more complex. But here is the thing, and this is maybe the most comforting thought to carry into sleep. Every previous generation of physicians believed, at some point, that they had reached the limits of what was knowable and treatable. The Hippocratic physicians thought they had the complete framework. Galen followers thought he had said the final word. The physicians of the early 20th century thought infectious disease would be conquered forever. They were all wrong, but not because they were foolish. They were wrong because the universe is deeper and more complex than any single framework can capture, and every answer opens up 10 new questions. And that is okay. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked. The history of medicine is a history of getting a little less wrong, generation by generation, of peeling back one more layer, of finding the next microbe, the next molecule, the next mechanism. And right now, as you lie there, your body is doing all the things we talked about at the beginning, fighting off invaders, healing wounds, maintaining the astonishing equilibrium that keeps you alive, using mechanisms that scientists are still discovering and still learning to support. You are the beneficiary of every person in this story, every wrong theory that was eventually corrected, every right discovery that was initially ignored, every lonely researcher who kept working when nobody believed them, every patient who volunteered for an uncertain treatment, every public health worker who built a sewer, or cleaned a water supply, or administered a vaccine. All of it, the whole vast, messy, magnificent story of medicine, converges in this moment, in you, in the body that is carrying you gently into sleep. Rest well. The story continues in the morning. And when it does, when the sun comes up and the world begins again, the healers will be there. In the hospitals and the clinics and the laboratories and the villages, doing what healers have always done, pushing back the darkness, one patient, one discovery, one small act of care at a time.